United States has never defaulted on its debt. You have heard this line from politicians, from cable news anchors, from economics professors. It is the bedrock of American financial identity. It is printed into the DNA of every Treasury bond prospectus. It is the foundation of the entire global monetary system. It is also a lie, a documented, provable, exposed in the Congressional Record lie. The United States has defaulted at least 3 times through direct, documented mechanisms. In 1790, Alexander Hamilton restructured Continental Congress debts, leaving original creditors holding pennies on the dollar. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt signed a joint resolution abrogating gold clauses in government bonds, telling every bondholder in America that the gold they were promised no longer belonged to them. The Supreme Court upheld it in Perry v. United States, 294 U.S. 330, and the government kept the gold. In 1979, the Treasury failed to redeem $122 million in T-bills on time because of a debt ceiling fight and a processing failure. Investors who held the safest asset on earth got a notice saying their money was late. And then there is 1971. On August 15th of that year, Richard Nixon closed the gold window, telling every foreign government holding dollars that the gold backing those dollars no longer existed. France, Britain, and Japan had been promised 1 ounce of gold for every $35 they held. Nixon erased that promise with a Sunday night television address. The international monetary system did not call it a default, but every foreign central bank that held dollars instead of gold lost purchasing power overnight. 4 separate events, 4 broken promises. Each one restructured the terms of American debt without the consent of the people who held it. That is the definition of default. The vocabulary changes, the outcome does not. This is Noob Historian. Every war, every empire, every revolution has a price tag. We find it. Here is why this matters to you right now, today, in 2026. 3 days ago, on March 17th, the gross national debt of the United States crossed $39 trillion. Not $39 trillion in some distant future projection, $39 trillion on the Treasury Department's ledger today. Interest payments alone are on pace to exceed $1 trillion this fiscal year. That is more than the government spends on national defense, more than it spends on Medicare. The Congressional Budget Office projects the debt will reach $56 trillion by 2036 and 120% of GDP. You're living inside the largest debt experiment in human history, and history has already shown you the ending 5 times. To understand where America stands, you need to understand the mechanics of each prior default. They follow a pattern. And that pattern is running again. The 1790 restructuring. When the United States was born, it inherited war debts from the Continental Congress. And these debts were owed in continental currency and in bonds sold to fund the Revolution. Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary, proposed a plan. The federal government would assume the state's war debts. It would honor the old bonds, but not at face value. Hamilton offered new bonds at reduced terms, paying creditors less than what they were owed. This was not a voluntary exchange. Creditors had no alternative. The Continental Congress no longer existed, and the new federal government offered them a take-it-or-leave-it swap. For the original farmers and soldiers who loaned money to the Revolution, this was a haircut. Many had already sold their bonds to speculators at steep discounts because they doubted they would be repaid at all. Hamilton's plan enriched the speculators and shortchanged the original lenders. The new nation began its financial life by breaking its first promise. The 1933 Gold Clause abrogation. By 1933, the United States was 3 years into the Great Depression. Banks were failing. Deflation gripped the economy. Gold was flowing out of the country as foreign creditors redeemed dollars for metal. Roosevelt faced a choice: honor the gold clauses written into government bonds and private contracts, or seize control of the money supply. He chose control. On June 5th, 1933, Congress passed a joint resolution canceling every gold clause in every public and private contract in the United States. If you held a government bond that promised repayment in gold, that promise was void. If you held a private mortgage that referenced gold, that clause was erased. The government then revalued gold from $20.67 per ounce to $35 per ounce, an instant 69% devaluation of the dollar's gold equivalent. The Supreme Court heard the case. In Perry v. United States, the court ruled that Congress had acted illegally in abrogating gold clauses on government bonds. The government had no right to break its own contracts. But the court then ruled that the bondholders suffered no measurable damages because the government also made it illegal to own gold. You are owed gold, the court said, but since you are forbidden from holding gold, you have lost nothing. This legal reasoning deserves your attention. The government broke its contract, declared the breach legal, and then removed the evidence of harm by criminalizing the asset it had promised. The bondholder was made whole by a fiction. The 1971 gold window closure. By 1971, the United States was running deficits to fund the Vietnam War and the Great Society program simultaneously. Foreign governments, particularly France under Charles de Gaulle, noticed that America was printing far more dollars than it held in gold reserves. France began redeeming dollars for gold and loading the metal onto ships bound for Paris. Britain made similar demands. Nixon convened advisors at Camp David on a Friday evening. By Sunday night, he announced on national television that the United States would no longer redeem dollars for gold at any price. He called it temporary. It was permanent. Every foreign central bank holding dollar reserves took an immediate loss. The Bretton Woods system, built in 1944 on the promise that dollars were as good as gold, collapsed within 2 years. The dollar lost a third of its value against gold within months and continued falling for a decade. The government never called this a default, but the Bank of France, the Bank of England, and every central bank that had accumulated dollars on the promise of gold convertibility experienced it as one. A contract was broken. A promise was erased. The 1979 technical default. This one is precise and measurable. In the spring of 1979, Congress was fighting over the debt ceiling. At the same time, the Treasury Department was upgrading its word processing equipment. The combination of political delay and technical failure meant that the Treasury missed payment on $122 million in maturing T-bills. Investors who held the safest, most liquid asset on the planet received their money late. Some waited days, some waited weeks. The Treasury paid them back with interest. But the damage was permanent. Terry Zevny and Richard Marcus, publishing in the Financial Review in 1989, studied the aftermath. They found that T-bill interest rates jumped 60 basis points after the default. That increase never reversed. It became embedded in the risk premium of Treasury debt. Applied across the total outstanding debt of the United States, that 60 basis point increase translated into billions of dollars in added annual borrowing costs. A single missed payment, lasting days, on $122 million in bills, permanently raised the price America pays to borrow. If you want to see the future of a defaulting superpower, do not look at Argentina or Greece. Look at Spain under Philip II. In the second half of the 1500s, Spain was the United States of its era. It controlled the world's reserve currency. Silver from the mines of Potosi and modern Bolivia flowed through Seville and financed the most formidable military on earth. The Spanish crown collected taxes from the Americas, from the Netherlands, from Naples, from Sicily. Philip II ruled a global empire whose GDP dwarfed every competitor. He defaulted 4 times, in 1557, 1575, 1576, and 1596. The academic evidence is granular. Drelichman and Voth, in their study Debt and Default in the Age of Philip II, analyzed 457 individual lending contracts between the Spanish crown and its Genoese bankers. They found that Philip's debts reached 60% of GDP. His interest payments consumed a growing share of tax revenue. The bankers kept lending because they had no alternative borrower who offered the same scale of business and the same collateral and silver revenues. Sound familiar? Here's what happened after each default. The Crown renegotiated terms. Creditors took losses. The bankers returned to the table within months because Spain still controlled the silver. But each default eroded the terms. Each restructuring gave the bankers more control over Spanish tax collection. Each settlement weakened the Crown's freedom to spend on its own priorities. By the time Philip II died in 1598, interest payments consumed 2/3 of Castile's total revenue. Spain did not collapse overnight. It entered a slow decline that took a century to complete. The silver kept flowing, the military kept fighting, but the empire's financial independence was gone. Every decision, from war to infrastructure to colonial policy, ran through the banker's ledger first. The parallel to the United States is structural. America does not have silver mines. It has the dollar's reserve currency status, which functions identically. It allows the government to borrow at rates and volumes that no other nation can access. And the mechanism of erosion is identical too. Each fiscal crisis does not produce a sudden break. It produces a slow transfer of leverage, from the borrower to the lender. Each debt ceiling fight, each credit downgrade, each trillion added to the total shifts the balance. Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff spent a decade building the most comprehensive dataset on sovereign defaults in academic history. Published in 2009 as This Time is Different, 8 Centuries of Financial Folly, their research covered 66 countries across 800 years. Their findings are blunt. Sovereign default is not an anomaly. It is a recurring feature of the global financial system. The median output loss following a sovereign debt crisis is 9.3% of GDP. Recovery takes 4 to 8 years. Countries that cross a debt-to-GDP threshold of approximately 90% experience significantly reduce growth. The United States passed that threshold years ago. Apply the 9.3% GDP loss to the current American economy. The U.S. GDP is approximately $29 trillion. A 9.3% contraction equals $2.7 trillion in lost output. To translate that into human terms, the 2008 financial crisis, the worst economic event in most Americans' living memory, produced a GDP contraction of approximately 4.3%. A sovereign default, based on 800 years of data, would be twice as severe. The NBER's 2024 research on the social costs of sovereign default adds another layer. 10 years after a default, 10% more households in the defaulting nation live in poverty compared to non-defaulting nations. The infant mortality rate rises, educational attainment drops. And the data shows that longer defaults produce worse outcomes on every metric. This is not theory, this is measurement. Across centuries, across continents, across economic systems, the pattern holds. Reinhardt and Rogoff also documented a cognitive bias they call the "this time is different" syndrome. Every generation of policymakers believes its circumstances are unique. They believe their country's debt is safe because their currency is the reserve currency, because their economy is the largest, because their institutions are strong. Spain believed this. Britain believed this. Every defaulting nation in the dataset believed it. The data shows that the belief itself is the leading indicator. The numbers you need to understand are not the total debt. The total debt is abstract. It is a number so large it loses meaning. The number you need to watch is the interest payment. In fiscal year 2026, the United States will pay over $1 trillion in net interest on its debt. This is not a projection for some future decade. This is the current budget year. The CBO's February 2026 report confirmed it. The fiscal year-to-date figure through early 2026 already stands at $520 billion, tracking toward a full-year number exceeding $1 trillion. Here is what that means in structural terms. Interest is now consuming approximately 17% of all federal spending. It exceeds the defense budget. It exceeds spending on veterans. It is closing in on Social Security as a share of the budget. And unlike Social Security or defense, interest payments produce nothing. They do not build roads. They do not train soldiers. They do not feed children. They are pure rent paid to the holders of past debt. The CBO projects this will get worse. By 2036, annual interest costs will reach $2.1 trillion. Net interest over the next decade will total $16.2 trillion. The deficit in 2026 is $1.9 trillion. By 2036, it grows to $3.1 trillion. Debt held by the public rises from 101% of GDP today to 120% by 2036, shattering the previous record of 106% set at the end of World War II. The CBO director's testimony to Congress in March 2026 used language that government officials rarely employ. The statement said, "The fiscal trajectory is not sustainable." In the vocabulary of government reporting, where every word is reviewed by lawyers and press offices, not sustainable means the math no longer works. This creates a feedback loop. Higher debt produces higher interest payments. Higher interest payments increase the deficit. Higher deficits add to the debt. Each cycle accelerates the next. Reinhardt and Rogoff documented this loop in dozens of historical cases. Once interest payments cross a threshold as a share of revenue, the sovereign loses the ability to grow out of the problem because the debt grows faster than the economy. Philip II of Spain experienced this loop. By the end of his reign, 2/3 of tax revenue went to interest. He kept fighting wars, kept building palaces, kept funding the Inquisition, but every new expenditure was borrowed and every new loan came at worse terms. The empire was running, but the engine was consuming its own fuel. There is one structural difference between the United States and every other defaulting nation in history. America borrows in its own currency. When Argentina defaults, it owes dollars or euros it cannot print. When Greece defaults, it owes euros controlled by the European Central Bank. The United States borrows dollars, and the United States prints dollars. This is what economists call the exorbitant privilege. It is the reason America has run deficits for decades without triggering the cascading failures that destroyed other nations. Foreign governments and investors buy Treasury bonds because the dollar is the world's reserve currency. They hold dollars because global trade in oil, commodities, and financial instruments is denominated in dollars. This creates constant structural demand for American debt. But the shield is eroding, and the evidence is documented. China held $1.2 trillion in U.S. Treasuries at its peak. As of late 2025, that number fell to $683.5 billion, a 50% reduction. In February 2026, Chinese regulators instructed domestic banks to cut back their U.S. Treasury positions, citing concentration risk and market volatility. This was not a market reaction. It was a policy directive from Beijing. Japan, the largest foreign holder of U.S. Treasuries at $1.225 trillion as of January 2026, faces its own structural pressure. The Bank of Japan has been shifting its interest rate policy, moving away from the negative rates and yield curve control that kept Japanese investors searching for yield in American bonds. As Japanese domestic rates rise, the incentive for Japanese institutions to hold U.S. Treasuries weakens. The BRICS bloc, now including Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and several new members, is actively pursuing alternatives to dollar-denominated trade. The July 2025 BRICS summit in Rio de Janeiro produced no unified currency, but the direction of travel is documented. BRICS nations reduced their US dollar reserves from 58.2% of holdings in 2024 to 56.92% in early 2026. Russia is preparing yuan-denominated government bonds. India and China are settling bilateral trade in local currencies. None of these developments is fatal in isolation. The dollar remains dominant, but the pattern matches the documented decline of the British pound as a reserve currency after World War II. In 1945, sterling accounted for the majority of global reserves. Britain was bankrupt from the war, but maintained its reserve currency status through the structure of the international system and collective global interest in its continuation. The decline was gradual. Sterling lost its role as a reserve currency over roughly 3 decades, with final collapse in the late 1970s. The mechanism was the same one playing out now. Creditors did not abandon sterling overnight. They diversified slowly. Each year, a few more central banks shifted a few more percentage points of their reserves into dollars. Each crisis, from the 1947 convertibility crisis to the 1956 Suez debacle to the 1967 devaluation, accelerated the trend. Britain maintained the appearance of financial dominance long after the substance had drained away. The United States today is not where Britain was in 1967. It is where Britain was in 1952 or 1955. Still dominant, still essential, but watching the first cracks form in a structure that everyone assumes is permanent. So what happens if the United States reaches a point where it cannot or will not pay its debt? History has answered this 5 times on American soil and hundreds of times across 66 countries over 800 years. The Playbook is documented. Stage 1, the interest rate shock. The 1979 technical default, lasting days on $122 million in T-bills, permanently raised borrowing costs by 60 basis points. A full default on trillions in outstanding Treasury securities would produce a rate shock orders of magnitude larger. Every mortgage in America is priced off Treasury rates. Every corporate bond is priced off Treasury rates. Every car loan, student loan, and credit card rate would spike simultaneously. Stage 2, the currency devaluation. In 1933, the government devalued the dollar by 69% against gold. In 1971, the dollar lost a third of its gold value and continued falling. A modern default would trigger a flight from dollar-denominated assets. The NBER data shows that defaulting nations experience average currency depreciation of 30% or more within the first year. For American consumers, this means the price of every imported good, from oil to electronics to food, rises overnight. Stage 3, the credit freeze. When a sovereign defaults, the banking system freezes. Treasury bonds are the collateral underlying the entire financial system. Banks hold them as Tier 1 capital. Money market funds hold them as safe assets. The repurchase agreement market, which provides overnight funding for banks, runs on Treasury collateral. If those bonds lose their risk-free status, the collateral chain breaks. Reinhardt and Rogoff document that banking crises follow sovereign defaults with high frequency. Stage 4, the social toll. The NBER's data is specific. 10 years after a default, 10% more households live in poverty. The median GDP loss is 9.3%. Recovery takes 4 to 8 years. Applied to the United States, that means a contraction twice the severity of the 2008 crisis, followed by a half-decade or longer of reduced growth. Stage 5, the slow replacement. No reserve currency has ever been replaced overnight. The process takes decades. Sterling's decline took 30 years. But once the process begins, it does not reverse. Each default, each crisis, each broken promise shifts the world's financial infrastructure away from the defaulting currency and toward alternatives. The petrodollar system, the SWIFT payments network, the dominance of U.S. financial institutions as global intermediaries, all of these rest on the assumption that the U.S. government honors its debts. Remove that assumption, and the infrastructure shifts, slowly at first, then all at once. The United States has an advantage no prior defaulting superpower possessed: the Federal Reserve and its ability to print the currency in which the debt is denominated. This is the reason most analysts say a technical default, a missed payment due to a debt ceiling fight, is more likely than a true inability to pay. The government has the printing press. It will always be able to produce dollars. But printing your way out of debt is not free. It is the 1933 playbook and the 1971 playbook running simultaneously. It means devaluing the currency, which transfers wealth from savers and bondholders to the government. It means inflation, which is a tax on every person who holds dollars. It means the slow erosion of the exorbitant privilege, as foreign creditors watch their dollar-denominated assets lose value and begin diversifying. The debt ceiling was raised to $41.1 trillion in July 2025 through the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. The gross debt crossed $39 trillion on March 17, 2026, 3 days ago. At the current pace of $7.2 billion per day in new debt accumulation, the $41.1 trillion ceiling will bind within a year or two. Another crisis, another negotiation, another step through the same loop that Reinhardt and Rogoff documented across 800 years. You're not watching this from outside the system. Your savings account, your retirement fund, your mortgage rate, the price of your groceries. All of it is connected to the U.S. government's ability to borrow at favorable terms. Every basis point of increased interest cost comes out of the federal budget, which means less money for services you depend on and more money flowing to bondholders in New York, London, Tokyo, and Beijing. The $39 trillion question is not whether the United States will default. History shows that the question is always when and how. The precedents are documented. The mechanisms are known. The data spans 8 centuries and 5 continents. The answer is not hiding. It is sitting in the Congressional Research Service archive, in the CBO's own projections, and in the Treasury Department's daily debt report. The official story says America has never defaulted. The ledger says otherwise, and the ledger always wins.